Liminal spaces are kind of hard to explain. It's a lot more of a feeling than a solid definition, and even then it changes depending on where and when you were raised, what stage in life you're in, how you deal with change, and countless other factors. If I show you this image, for example, you'd probably mark it as a liminal space if you were born anytime from the 90s to early 2000s, attended public school, and spent your childhood in the United States. On the other hand, this could resonate with anyone who's ever been to a theme park during business hours and thinks seeing an abandoned roller coaster on a dark and foggy night feels unnatural. If you're ultra pretentious, maybe this is the only image in this lineup you feel like truly represents liminality, and all of that is fine. If you're anything like me, before I spent 12 hours researching this video, the differences between these three images is not obvious, so I guess it's best to start with the question, what is liminality? Liminality, at its core, is a suspension in a threshold state, which at face value doesn't mean much of anything, but it's pretty much just being between where you once were and where you're going, whether that's a mindset or a physical location. Imagine you're on an airplane, mid-flight. You're traveling to a place you weren't before, and while you haven't reached your destination yet, you also aren't where you began the journey. So here you are, suspended in the in-between. Then there's liminality in identity. And this one's kind of hard to explain because there's a lot of cultural context that change from person to person, but one of the most universal examples of this is adolescence, going to puberty. You aren't a kid anymore, but you also aren't an adult, even if you might think differently at the time. So you're in a perpetual state of transition. Some of the earliest mentions of liminality online are a lot less palatable. From therapists giving advice to people who'd just been diagnosed with cancer or just lost a child, liminality for the longest time was only spoken about in online spheres in relation to negative changes. There was always this feeling of apparent hopelessness that stemmed from life-altering events, which makes sense because liminality in definition is synonymous with irreversibility. That's why it's such a heavy feeling. It wasn't until 2019, though, that liminal spaces as the aesthetic we've grown accustomed to in popular culture was introduced. Now the question is, what makes a space liminal? If we strictly stick to the definition of liminality, a liminal space is only somewhere that's physically transitional. Liminality in photography and other media revolves around the sense of lingering in a region or state that would usually be passed without a second's thought. So, an elevator, road, stairs, things of that nature. But, look at these pictures. You could not convince me that if you saw these in the wild, you would be excited to post them to the liminal space subreddit, and that could be because you aren't socially inept enough to use Reddit, or that could be because they just don't give off that feeling that a liminal space should. So obviously there's a lot more factors at play here. Intercanopsia. Canopsia? Pulled from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, canopsia is the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually bustling with people but is now abandoned and quiet. A school hallway in the evening, an unlit office on a weekend, vacant fairgrounds, an emotional afterimage that makes it seem not just empty, but hyper-empty, with a total population in the negative who are so conspicuously absent they glow like neon signs. A long-winded way of saying an empty space that normally is holding some form of life. In successful liminal space photography, almost every one of these places is canopsetic, even when they stray so far from the original definition of liminality. So why do they work? I mentioned earlier that liminal spaces were transitional locations, right? Somewhere that's a vessel between one place and another. But it could be worth broadening the qualifications a little bit to say that a liminal space is anywhere where we're not really meant to exist for a long period of time. I mean, there's a bit of semantic drift between how liminality was originally defined in the 20th century versus how we use the word to define a liminal space now, but that's normal. After 100 years, words change meaning a lot of the time. So, with that in mind, we know two things now. A liminal space should be devoid of people, and it should be somewhere that we're meant to pass through without stopping to analyze it. I sifted through a bunch of liminal space photography and found that most of these images still felt like they enveloped a lot more than just those two stipulations. So, what is it? What's that one thing that makes a place feel like a liminal space? It's actually frustrating trying to come up with the right words to describe a liminal space because I realize there's so many variations of it. Like, liminal space is a broad term that encompasses a bunch of smaller categories. So, on that note, here is a list of a bunch of liminal space categories that I came up with, and I'm sure there are more, but these I feel like encompass most of what we see in liminal space photography. Transitional. I'll start with transitional because it's the easiest to understand given the definition I've given of liminality already. Here's a hallway, an alley, a waiting room, all of which are places you travel through or briefly wait in to get somewhere else. It's not a final destination. It's also worth noting that everything here is a little dark or claustrophobic, which really adds to the uncomfortability of liminal spaces that we're so used to. This is probably a good time to say that creepiness is not an inherent factor in liminal spaces. It's definitely great and giving our audience an emotional tie to the image, but it's not necessary. There is one last picture here that I didn't put with the rest, and it's an image of a beach at night, empty of all life, but decorated with endless rows of chairs and umbrellas. What makes this fall into the transitional category is two things: the fact that it's nighttime, and the fact that this is clearly a beach during closing hours, which is something I want to focus on. We can tell this place is super busy during the day, right? There's a bunch of evidence of human life, but seeing these chairs at night feels strange because they were meant to be used, not to state the obvious. This is a place that's meant to be busy, so every night is just a transitional period between days to when the beach can be used to its fullest potential again. In that sense, this image is more transitional metaphorically than physically, but I hope I explained that well. This category kind of expands on the last point I was making, but long term. Each of these pictures shows somewhere that was built with the intention of daily use, but over time that kind of just stopped happening. And that's so strange, right? Like, these are places that aren't truly part of the past, but don't really feel like they're in the present either. As said by photographer John Stoughton, abandoned places that once had purpose but now stand unused or forgotten are in a perpetual state of liminality. Their old purpose is over, with the new purpose yet to be revealed. This is probably the most relatable category considering the pandemic and how abruptly these places we were used to seeing full of life just became empty. And this type of liminal space photography is why I feel like the aesthetic even grew as much as it did over the past few years. I'm sure most of us at some point in like April of 2020 went to a supermarket where there were like 5 people in the store at a time, nothing on the shelves, it felt abandoned. So this type of liminal space photography feels relatable. And that's one of the main appeals of liminal space photography. The more someone can look at an image and feel like they've been there before, the more successful it'll be, which pretty perfectly leads into my next category, which is nostalgia. At the beginning of the video, I talked about how you needed to have certain experiences to register this image as a liminal space, which is maybe not entirely fair, given the fact that nothing I've talked about is strictly exclusive to one group or another. You can feel however you want to feel, whenever you want to feel it. But it's not unrealistic to think that anyone who spent their childhood in the 80s before Chuck E. Cheese expanded would feel the nostalgia seeping off of this image like younger generations would. Like this picture, for example, illustrates a very specific time period. The small boxy TV, SpongeBob on the screen, probably taken in the home of some lower middle class family in 2002. I mean, this feels like a place I've been before, which is why I'm even focusing on it so much. I'm making a point. Nostalgia is just such a strong feeling, which is why when it comes to liminal space photography, posts like these that I can relate my younger years to are the most successful to me. They resonate the most with me. On the liminal space subreddit, there's a section you're supposed to read before you post anything, and there's a part where they talk about how we should stay away from posting anything related to nostalgia because it's not really relatable to a wide audience, which I get to some extent, but as relatability goes down, there's a higher payoff, so I think you just gotta pick your battles. On that note, there is a feeling called Animalia, which is another word I've pulled from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, and it's defined as nostalgia for a time you've never known. Naturally, this refers to anyone who longs to experience a time period from before they were born. Like, for example, someone my age who went through an embarrassingly long period of being obsessed with 80s media and culture following Stranger Things, but that's just an example. So, who's to say that in 50 years there won't be some kid who comes back to this image and feels incredibly nostalgic even though they've never been in a place like this? I guess what I'm getting at is that liminal spaces that fall under the nostalgic category can resonate with a wider audience than originally intended, which is why I don't think it's entirely fair to rule them out completely. This is the last category, and it's the most difficult to explain, but I will try. I think a lot of liminal space photography relies on the uncanny, and for good reason. I mean, it's unsettling, but why? When I was first building these categories, quite a few images went into the uncanny file, but I couldn't even vocalize why at the time. Even now, I've kind of just settled on the idea that pictures like this go into the uncanny category because it feels like they were constructed by aliens, or at least aliens attempting to construct human architecture. It feels unnatural, completely unrelatable, which kind of entirely ruins the point I was making before about nostalgia. But it's a liminal space nonetheless. If we get super psychological, we could say that this adheres to liminality because it feels like a space between worlds. I'm mostly sure that aliens weren't involved behind the scenes, but whenever someone does us the favor of capturing such peculiar design choices or some incredible weather patterns, it feels otherworldly. I think it's also worth noting that most, if not all, liminal space photography centers around some sort of man-made structure. And while there probably isn't a conscious effort to do this, there's clearly something about empty buildings or whatever else that adds to that feeling of liminality. There's an article on the Sabukaru online website called Liminal Spaces, Lost in Unknowable Loneliness of Modern Architecture that I think breaks down the topic so well and coherently. I strongly recommend reading it yourself, even if you aren't all that interested in the discussion. The article is still pretty, you should check it out. Anyway, there are some really insightful points made. In regards to liminal spaces that are empty rooms or buildings, the author says, these images help us understand the loneliness and futility of modern architectural achievements. Without the distraction of living subjects in the photos, the sometimes absurd spaciousness helps us realize that even in the comfort of our own home, neighborhood, or city, we are in nothing more than an artificial desert, one made to distract us from the reality and spontaneity of our natural world. It is one thing to be lost in the wilderness, but to be lost in the hallways of your own creation is another thing entirely. And with that is all I have today. Liminal spaces can be anywhere from absolutely terrifying to strangely comforting, and I love that there's a way that we can explain why we have such intense reactions to these photos, and why certain images over others. Emotions can seem very irrational, but it's worth digging into why you feel the way you do about something. It's not until you get the proper vocabulary to describe an emotion that you're able to control it and use it in your own creations. But it seems like the popularity of liminal spaces is only growing in popular media. The Overlook Hotel in The Shining, Silent Hill, and if you're into gaming, the plethora of indie games about the backrooms, which I will definitely share my gripes with in a future video, but for now, this is getting pretty long. The point is that we're obviously fascinated with liminal spaces, and I hope that I've been able to kind of help you understand why. Yeah, thank you so much for watching all the way through. I'm gonna go. Bye.